of you, and I would like to start the conversation with the simple and obvious question: what do we mean when we say sacred activism? What is this? So I'm sure many of us have an idea about sacred activism, but I think it's worth really diving into what this could be, what its potential could be, the dimension of sacred activism, why this combination of words, sacred and activism. And maybe you would like to start.
Sure. I mean, it was interesting because when I wrote the email about this call, I thought about the pipeline protests or the water protectors, to make an important distinction, that the water protectors in North Dakota were basically saying we want to defend the sacred. We want to defend the sacred from being destroyed by this pipeline, and that meant a sacred water, a sacred place. So they were speaking about the sacred as something very concrete. Mm. And we know that there are sacred places, power places, places that have been given through just the nature of the place or through human prayer, have developed a certain quality to them that touches one and brings one into a relationship with something deeper and bigger. Mm-hmm. That is a kind of sacred activism to protect and defend those kinds of places. But I think there are a lot of different ways of thinking about sacredness and activism. Mm-hmm. And I think the way that I tend to think about it is that the sacredness is a reference to wholeness. Mm. It's an activism or a way of trying to think about making change that starts from a recognition that there is a prior unity, that there is a wholeness to life and to our being together on this planet and with the planet, that is a very dramatically different ground for making change than trying to stand against something.
When I think about the term sacred activism, there are two dimensions that I find very interesting, and they are all held together by a single point: the realness of the sacred. Because sacred activism really just gives acknowledgement that there is something which is sacred, and that in itself, particularly if you talk about it in the terms of activism, is not a given thing. Because in our secular time, to talk about that there is something sacred, and we even can talk about what do we mean. But I honestly think it's not even so important to agree exactly what this sacred is. It's much more important that we honor that there is something that is worth being called sacred, because that's already a lot. Mm-hmm. If you really slow down and look, the word sacred is a word that is more a taboo zone than other taboo zones that we are aware. It's in a kind of in New Age field that's different, but in a usual secular society context, to talk about the sacred it is often not something that is a given. And and then that the two dimensions that I meant are, one, that this is an activism that somehow is about the sacred. You mentioned sacred places, sacred dimension, sacred relationships. And you mentioned the American indigenous battle that they had about these oil lines, but these are our sacred grounds, and defend the sacred is a slogan. Mm-hmm. That's one dimension that I find very intriguing and worth thinking about. There are things that are sacred that need our activism. Mm-hmm. They not only need my spiritual practice, they need our activism. And just to see it that way, that activism, sacredness needs us. It needs us being active out there. That's the one dimension. And the other dimension is, which of course is very related, that when we talk about activism, that there's a certain kind of activism that has a certain quality that is sacred. Because there can be political activism, there can be ecological activism, there can be feminist activism. That does not necessarily mean at all that the way I'm active is in a way of honoring the sacred. So that it's kind of the mode of activism that maybe is different. And really to ask, is there a way of activism that is not only about sacredness, but in the way that we are active honors the sacred and works with the sacred, so that that the mode of activism holds a particular dimension that maybe is not so easy to see. It's maybe more subtle to be aware of, because it's to really fight for justice, to really fight for social rights. It's something sometimes very concrete. But what does it mean to do this in a way that, in the way we are doing it, is holding the sacred, and the other dimension is for the sacred. So these are these dimensions that I find very interesting in contemplating what sacred activism is.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, it brings to mind, and what part of what you're saying is, where are the activists coming from in their in wanting to create change, and what's the point of the change making in a sense also. How does that embody or bring alive the sacred? And just to, you mentioned secular society. I mean, we really, at a global level, at a globalization level, we live in a culture that is that really holds very little sacred, or doesn't hold, that actually is has been built on denying that there is anything that is in this special category of sacredness. And yet it also seems that every human being, or most human beings, it's hard to say, have something that they would call or consider to be sacred, to be something, and that meaning to be something that is, you could say, without which human life is impoverished. Our deepest, most profound core sense of what it means to be alive, or human, or part of the biosphere. How is it? What is the sacred is something that connects us to that which is indivisible, that which is beyond all of us, and that holds everything. And how do we, in a culture that sort of has more of an instrumental relationship to everything on the planet, seeing human beings and seeing sentient life forms and seeing the earth as a source of resource, rather than as a whole, or as wholes within wholes that have a living integrity that needs to be honored. Bringing how we stand in relationship to the or upholding the sacred in a context like that, it seems to me to be critically important.
And also, to illustrate that more, I think it's helpful to think about this one big event that we did now. What is it, 1 month ago?
Almost exactly a month ago.
Exactly a month ago, One World Bearing Witness. Because to my understanding, and as I know also to your understanding, this was a form of sacred activism. Right. That was at least our intention to do that. And what do we mean by saying that? It always sounds beautiful, sacred activism. It's a beautiful word. At least to me it sounds beautiful. But what do we mean that this was a form of sacred activism? I think for the ones of you who saw that or saw part of it, it makes sense to say that in some degree one could say we didn't do anything in terms of activism. I mean, there was no protest, there was no kind of, we just came together on a global level and had dialogues and ceremonies and meditation. That's what we did. So what is this? What does this mean in terms of activism? Activism is about changing the world. So is this kind of a nice thing where we feel better and it feels nice to be connected to everyone? Or is it just that? I'm deeply convinced that is not the case. I'm deeply convinced we did something, and I mostly can talk from my own experience, but also from the experience of quite some people I talked to, that there was a living network of connection that was created between people who themselves are deeply connected both to the sacred dimension in their own world, maybe Aborigines in Australia and their own kind of form of sacred relationship to the land, may be a Benedictine monk like Brother David Steiner Rust in his Catholic spirituality. They were all people who in themselves were deeply related to this dimension in one way or the other. And they were all people who in one way or the other were deeply related to the social, ecological dimension of our world and the pain that humans inflict on each other, that we inflict on Earth, that society, economics, finance industry, you name it, all that was part of where they are also connected to. And everyone who was part of this 24 hours was very interested to connect with each other. And it changed my relationship and my capacity to respond to whatever I need to respond to also here in Germany, and in the particular political, ecological environment that I'm in, with the communities I'm in. And I know it changed, and it only strengthened our Filipino friends to have this healing ceremony that did witnessed by all of us. And I know, because so many people said, so many people were strengthened and deeply touched by being part of this healing ceremony of our Filipino friends. So there's something where, on a very subtle level, but very real, structures of healing, of sacred healing, of strengthening, of aliveness, were empowered by doing this. And this is a form that in itself, it's not everything, because you need all the dimensions. You need political action, you need social action, you need all forms. But this is an integral part that changes something in a dimension that usually activists don't see, are not aware of, don't focus on. And I'm just very happy that also many people that you invited as being guests are people like Ank, for example, who also have been part of the One World bearing witness and are in themselves example of holding this in their own way. And I'm just very deeply curious to learn from them and to hear from them how they see that, how they see the dimension. I'm sure they see it somehow different than I do, and have this as a global learning process. How to do this and find out what we are doing is something that I'm personally very excited to do.
I agree, and that's who we're hoping to invite more of these folks to engage with us in this forum, in this open forum. I would also suggest that I feel that sacred activism also works in a different way, and in a way that can be called a subtle activism. That while most activists are looking to transform the material realities that divide us, the real income disparity, the fact of war and conflict, to change laws, change regulations, and so forth. That this kind of sacred activism, or what we were trying to do, or working with for One World Bearing Witness, was to really call on a different dimension of reality, to bring us together in a way that allows us to see that there is really one humanity, that we each have different strengths, we have different struggles. Some of the different struggles that we have are incredibly important, or many of them are, for us all to recognize, to recognize the how profound these differences are between us, and even more profound is the unity that we share, and that we share that unity because of our common humanity, because of the fact that we share a planet, and because we share consciousness or spirit at the most fundamental level. But we have, in the development of human culture on this planet, we developed as cultures in different places that had regional engagement. But in terms of the whole, we have not been rubbing up against each other in prior centuries or thousands over the 1,000 years of cultural development on this planet. We've come to the point where we are really up against each other, and I mean we're just like rubbing up